Hello, welcome to PCAP's 5th Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Edward Bork from the University of Alberta and Dr. Mattheis Chair from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada will be speaking about linking rotational grazing with greenhouse gas dynamics in grassland soils. Before we begin, I would like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I would like to note that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel in the near future. As part of Prairie's Got the Goods Week, there will be 2 more webinars happening this week. Join us at 12 p.m. for a presentation about pollination, and that's tomorrow at 12 p.m. Friday's webinar will be about cattle grazing and soil carbon. For more information about these webinars or to register, just visit the PCAP website. If you click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week, you'll see a schedule for the week. Prairie's Got the Goods Week would not be possible without our sponsors. I would like to sincerely thank our presenting sponsors, Sask Energy and Wildlife Habitat Canada, as well as our supporting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask and Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. In-kind support is provided by the University of Alberta and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And if you're using the cell phone app, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about today's presenters. Dr. Bork is currently the Mattheis Chair in Rangeland Ecology and Management and serves as the director of the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta. He has been teaching and conducting range research for more than 20 years on a wide variety of basic and applied topics, including integrated weed control and pasture grazing systems, fire ecology, forage agronomy, landscape production dynamics, and agroforestry. Most recently, he has been leading and co-leading investigations examining the important role of grasslands and cattle grazing in providing alternative environmental goods and services such as carbon storage, greenhouse gas reduction, and biodiversity retention. He and his students have given numerous technology transfer talks over the last few decades. Dr. Bork maintains close ties with the agriculture industry, in which he and his family continue to reside on and operate a mixed grain and beef operation northeast of Edmonton, Alberta. Our second presenter, Dr. Mattheis Chair, is originally from Nepal, where he grew up in a farming family where they practiced integrated farming system that included annual crops, perennials, and livestock. He came to Canada in 2008 after receiving his PhD in soil science from Norway. He has a track record of research on soil carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics in different land use systems. Recently, 2017 to 2019, he worked as a research associate at the University of Alberta in a project that evaluated the effects of adaptive multi-paddock grazing and soil carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics in prairie grasslands. He and his team are active in knowledge sharing to producers and scientific communities through presentations at farmers' field days, conferences, and scientific publication. Dr. Chair is currently working as a biology study lead, soil health and fertility development at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Beaver Lodge Research Farm. He is developing applied research projects to enhance soil health and fertility in the Peace region in the context of climate change. Dr. Chair works closely with producers through applied research associations in the region and agricultural industries. He also collaborates with academic institutions, provincial government agencies, and other stakeholders. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Bork first.
Oh, no, don't want to do that. Oh, okay. Thank you, Caitlin. Good afternoon, everyone. Caitlin, can you see my screen okay? Everything looks good?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay, I just want to try to shuffle off. Is there a way I can minimize the size of the icon on the side?
If you click the orange arrow, it'll push it to the side.
Perfect. That's what I wanted. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So my thanks to Caitlin for the invite to come this afternoon. So Bharat and I are going to be talking to you a little bit about rotational grazing and a study that's been going on. Well, it started in 2016. It's been running for 5 years. It's just at the very tail end, in which we are really trying to identify whether specialized rotational grazing systems, and by that I mean these intensive, adaptive, multi-paddock, and there's many synonyms for it, whether that actually impacts important ecosystem goods and services such as greenhouse gas uptake and also carbon storage, but a whole host of other dynamics. I want to recognize also that this is very much a team effort. There are a lot of people involved in this, a number of different postdocs and primary scientists. This project is actually led by Mark Boyce. And so some of you may have seen portions of this before, and hopefully you'll be able to extract something new from it if you have seen portions of it. So just by way of introduction, when we talk about ecosystem goods and services, and we look back at the history of grasslands, the contemporary ecosystem good and service is really forage production and therefore livestock production. However, more recently, in the last 20 to 30 years, we're starting to recognize that the ecosystem goods and services provided by these areas are much more diverse than that. It includes things like carbon storage, pollination services, water storage, flood mitigation, water purification as well, and the provision of biodiversity and habitat for species at risk and also consumptive wildlife species. So the larger project is actually addressing a number of these different components. Today, we're really going to talk only about carbon storage and greenhouse gas dynamics. So we're only talking about a select portion of this larger project. And the reason why this topic is so important is if you look at grasslands globally, they are one of the largest habitat types that's out there, representing over 3 billion hectares, a very large portion of the Earth's surface. And in fact, grasslands are the primary or predominant agricultural land that's used globally. And if you look at it from a global kind of carbon stock storage perspective, upwards of a third of the total terrestrial carbon stock is found in these grasslands. So there's potential to not only maintain and conserve that carbon, but perhaps enhance it through the development of optimal management strategies. And so what we're interested in understanding here is whether these specialized rotational systems can be used to increase carbon storage and increase greenhouse gas uptake. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time reviewing some of the management effects. And there are hundreds of studies worldwide. And so my objective here is not to go through them all, but just to make sure that we're all thinking about the critical role of both land use change, but also grazing activities on soil organic carbon storage, and of course, associated greenhouse gas fluxes. So here's what we do know. If you take these grassland systems, these long-lived, long-established perennial grassland systems, and you convert them into annual cropland, we lose a lot of carbon. Walter Wilms, who's a retired scientist from Lethbridge, used to call it the furnace effect. And I thought that was a very apt descriptor, because really what we're doing is we're removing the insulating cover, we're warming the soil, and that coupled with greater oxygenation of the soil leads to much higher microbial breakdown of that carbon. And we globally, we lose anywhere from 30 up to 50 or 55% of the soil carbon. So a very significant fraction of what's in the atmosphere right now in terms of elevated CO2, we usually think of, fossil fuel and fossil fuel burning, but a portion of that, upwards of 25%, also is coming from land use change, and we need to be aware of that. So there's very specific data from Alberta, for example, that shows if you take those perennial systems, you convert it to wheat cropping, you lose up to 40% of the soil carbon. If you take those same native grasslands and you plant them or plow them down and seed them down to tame forages, so introduced forages, it's not as bad as annual cropping, but you still lose a certain amount of carbon, presumably because those plants are putting more of their biomass above ground rather than below ground, where we can access it for forage utilization. There are also differences between native and introduced grassland in terms of how that carbon is necessarily allocated. And there's separate work that we've done, for example, looking at the allocation of carbon within the mulch components, the above ground litter components, and so on. Bottom line is these native grasslands store a very significant amount of soil carbon, much more so than many of our agronomic systems, whether they're planted domestic forages or whether they're annual crop areas. We've also done some very interesting work across a network of sites in Alberta where we've compared the long-term presence versus exclusion of grazing. And I know I've reported that here before within this same seminar series, but I think it warrants repeating, because our long-term data suggests that the continuing presence of grazing animals actually maintains or even increases soil carbon concentration by up to 12%. And this is important because it means that we, when we think about trying to at least maintain carbon storage within these grasslands, grazing is a part of these systems. These grasslands evolve with herbivory. They're adapted to cope with herbivory. And it's not that we need to remove herbivory in order to maximize carbon storage. In fact, if we remove grazing, our data is showing that we actually lose carbon. So an important piece of maintaining carbon storage is to keep grazing these ecosystems. However, that has to be done at sustainable levels. And we also published another paper. This just came out last year. And this data is from the province of Saskatchewan, looking at mixed grass prairie carbon storage values. And what's unique about that, we were able to link our soil organic carbon stocks to long-term cattle stocking rates. And to our surprise, we actually found that higher stocking rates led to a net increase in soil organic carbon storage, particularly within the topsoil. So the top 15 centimeters of what's really the humified or organic matter enriched layer. And that signal was actually over and above any signature that we were detecting relative to climate itself, because we know that more rainfall, for example, increases plant growth and therefore carbon input into the system. So all of this preamble background is suggesting that grazing is a very important ecosystem process that's capable of maintaining and maybe even increasing carbon storage within these grasslands. So that brings us to the current study, the one that basically ran between 2016 and 2021, that's just wrapping up. And in this study, we basically tried to test questions around the effect of whatever you want to call it. We called it adaptive multi-paddock grazing, so AMP grazing, but there are many synonyms for this type of grazing. Some folks might refer to this as mob grazing, planned grazing, holistic grazing. I've done work on it before calling it high intensity, low frequency grazing, where you come through with very high densities of animals for short periods. Regenerative grazing is another term that's now being used, of which this type of grazing is an important process. Regardless of what you call it, these are all specialized rotational grazing systems. And of key importance is that they adaptively manage the animals to influence ecosystem processes. And by that, I mean, we're trying to control the intensity of grazing in space and time. We're trying to provide an adequate post-grazing recovery period to make sure that we have high rates of regrowth and that we maintain the vigor and productivity of the vegetation. And we're doing that by essentially modifying livestock distribution and therefore their behavior. So the diagram on the right here, for example, is an example of this. So this might be conventional grazing or season-long or continuous grazing, where these animals have the ability to go wherever they want, anytime they want throughout the growing season. And what that would do is create a very high level of patchiness in use. So one strategy is to then subdivide that area into many more smaller paddocks, and then to rotate through at higher densities among those paddocks. Now, in this example, there's only 4 paddocks that we've subdivided to. But we could divide out into 20 paddocks or 40 paddocks or 60 paddocks. And of course, those are decisions that the individual producer makes based on what they feel is going to be the optimal strategy for both their animal management objectives and their forage management objectives. So each individual grazing operation is really using their local knowledge and their experience to implement a given grazing system. And so the reason why we're so interested in this is because we recognize that if there's going to be any type of offset payment down the road for carbon storage or reduced greenhouse gas footprints from agricultural activities, including grazing, that will require a mechanistic and therefore a predictive framework for linking the management actions that we conduct as landowners and managers to individual ecosystem goods and services, in this case, carbon storage and greenhouse gas fluxes. Now, there's been lots of work that's been done on this in the past. And one thing I just want to caution you on is that what's often done in those previous studies is those studies will compare what's called continuous grazing, like we see on the left here, what we're calling conventional grazing, with a specialized form of grazing, but it usually involves a binary comparison. So you're either a season-long grazer or you're something else, or you're a specialized, for example, holistic grazer or AMP grazer or something else. And those binary comparisons, I'm going to argue today, are actually defeatist in what we're trying to do, because they do not fully document the full range of variability among producers in terms of their behavior. So that's going to be one of the key outcomes. And so what we did is we actually we conducted a comprehensive assessment where we started out by identifying AMP producers. We had as many as 100 that initially expressed an interest. And then we whittled that down to basically 30 individual AMP operators. This was a randomly selected cohort from a larger group, and they're distributed across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so that's one of the unique things about this study as well. The sheer scope in terms of the geophysical distribution of these sites was incredibly high and represented a very high range of not only climatic conditions, so we had sites in the mixed grass prairie, in the parkland, in the boreal transition, in the Alberta foothills, but covering a wide range of climate, soil, vegetation types, and so on. So the logistics of collecting all this data was indeed quite daunting. And for each one of these AMP operators, we identified a neighboring operator, which I'm designating as NAMP. So that's basically an across the fence line comparison. And we had the caveat that those two paired ranches that we were going to compare had to be on the same soil polygon. They were obviously within the same climatic unit, climatic condition, in order to facilitate the comparison. We also, initially at least, wanted to have them similar in terms of cultivation history, largely because going back to some of that preamble information I provided, we know that cultivation history has a very profound impact on carbon storage, okay? Okay, so these are the overall study goals. So this is across the entire AGGP AMP project. So we basically set out with a whole suite of different questions. We wanted to identify the land use history, and the way that we did that is through landowner and operator surveys. So we basically sent out a survey, and where there were clarifications needed, we followed up with them, and the individual landowners were excellent, providing us with really detailed feedback on how big their ranches were, how they graze, what's their pasture layout, what's the sequence of grazing, and so on. We've also measured things like forage productivity, root mass, plant community richness, so the number of different plant species, the diversity, and so on. Now, within this particular presentation, we are going to be presenting on land use history. We are also going to be presenting greenhouse gas data. So this is particularly the CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide fluxes. So Bharat's going to be sharing information on that. There's two different components there. There's an incubation trial and also a field study that he will talk about. And he will also review some of the soil carbon storage data, which I think you'll find very useful. We also have other data on soil microbial composition and enzyme activity. We're not going to, oops, I think I got a timer going or something. There's also soil microbial composition and enzyme activity, and also even bird diversity on a subset of these ranches. And I also want to just point out that there's also water infiltration data, and that's going to actually be reviewed on Friday, I believe at noon. Dr. Tim Daubert is going to be presenting the results of the water infiltration work, which I think you'll find of significant interest as well. So I won't give the key result away, and I'll let Tim deal with that on Friday. But if you're interested in that, that's just a kind of a pitch. So the rest of my portion of the talk here is simply going to be characterizing these AMP type operations. And so some of the key management-based questions that we asked are, for example, do AMP operators, so these are self-identified AMP operators, do they differ from their neighbors, where you can think about the neighbors as this kind of random sample of conventional Canadian beef producers? So did they differ in land use history, for example, cultivation and whether they were seeded and what they might have seeded on those properties? Do these ranches differ in size, configuration, so the number of paddocks, the size of paddocks? And then also, how do these AMP ranchers fundamentally differ from their neighbors in terms of specific grazing management practices? And by that, I'm talking about length of the grazing period versus the length of the individual rest periods. And so I already mentioned that we have this detailed management survey information. And so now I'm going to share with you some of the highlights that we identified from this. So this is all the survey data basically amalgamated down. So in hindsight, when we looked at what proportion of these ranches basically had a history of cultivation, and just for clarity here, all of these ranches had to be non-cultivated for at least the last 10 years. So they couldn't have been cultivated in the last 10 years. That was a minimum cutoff that we had. So they could have been uncultivated for 30 years or 40 years or in perpetuity. And what we found is the majority of them had some history of cultivation. So on average, the AMP 81, not sure why it's doing it, sorry folks. The AMP ranches, a little over 80% of those ranches actually were cultivated at some point in time in the past. In contrast, the NAMP, so the neighbors, were about 70%, so a little bit lower. The average time since planting, 19 years. So that basically means that there may be a legacy effect of annual cropping at some point in time, but it's actually been a significant period of time, pushing 2 decades on most of the ranches. The other thing is, we did ask individual producers about if they knew the seeding history, and all of the cultivated fields had pretty much been seeded. I think there was only one exception. Of the fields that have been seeded, we asked producers what was the dominant species that were seeded. And not surprisingly, alfalfa range, was a common species seeded, 80 to 90%, and almost, 90 to 100% indicated that they'd put in some type of legume, which is not surprising. The two things I want to draw your attention to are over here on the right side. I thought it was very interesting that the AMP producers were more likely to have seeded with native species. Now, native forage species are generally more expensive, they're harder to obtain, but they also may have benefits such as enhanced drought tolerance and drought adaptation. So I thought it was intriguing that almost 20% of AMP producers had included at least some kind of native plant within their mix. That wasn't the case for the neighbors. And another thing is that if we look at the complexity of the mixtures, that AMP producers were generally more likely, about twice as likely, to utilize a seed mixture that actually was much more diverse, so 5 species or more. So this might be a risk adaptation strategy, trying to seed more species in order to make sure that there's going to be something that's going to establish and be able to survive under the conditions, whether it's dealing with salinity or drought or whatever it is over time. So I thought that was an interesting side outcome. Certainly was not a planned objective, but it was a nice bonus to come across. Okay, I want to talk a little bit now about the ranch physical attributes. So again, remember that we screened for the AMP, and then we looked at whatever the neighboring property was. So we didn't screen out the neighbors based on size or anything like that. But when we looked at the size of the land areas that were either under AMP management or the neighboring, so conventional management, the AMP operators were much larger in size, much, much larger. And not surprisingly, of course, they supported that larger land base supported a larger total herd size. So that raises a really intriguing question. Is the AMP ranching method more likely to happen or take place on lands that are larger? In other words, do larger land bases, are they more conducive to supporting these more complex rotational systems? I think it's an interesting question that probably needs some more follow-up. Another question that we asked is, what's the configuration of these pastures? And so we had data on the number of pastures and the individual pasture sizes. And so, as you would expect, the AMP ranches had a very large number of pastures per operation, just over 60, in fact. That's a mean number, as compared to the non-AMP that had, typically somewhere around less than 4 or 5 on average across all of the conventional producers. And of course, the pasture sizes are the exact opposite. If you have a lot of pastures, you're going to have much smaller pastures. The mean pasture size was somewhere around 20 hectares for the AMP, whereas the neighboring operators were much larger than that, pushing 120 hectares. So you can see the physical layout is very different among these operations. And of course, that translates into their management philosophy. Okay, we also asked questions about when the animals went in, what kind of animals went in, yearlings, cow, calf, start of the grazing season, end of the grazing season. We were able to use all that information to compute out both a mean stock density. So you can think about this metric as a herd effect or a stock density effect. And then we also computed an actual stocking rate, which takes into account the length of time that these areas are being grazed for. What's really conspicuous here is that there is no difference in the mean stocking rate between AMP and the neighbors. Yeah, there's a bit of a trend for the AMP to be slightly higher, but it's really not significant. The p-value tells us that statistically there's no difference between the two. What is very different is the mean stock density. So the AMP producers, by having this framework of a very large number of pastures that are much smaller in size, we're able to maintain a much, much higher stock density. And so, those of you that are familiar with regenerative grazing or holistic grazing, you're very familiar with stock density or herd effect, and this is what's generally creating that effect. However, this effect, at least based on DART data, is happening irrespective of stocking rates, which are actually quite similar between the two operations. We also looked at the kind of temporal allocation of forage use. The start of the grazing season was generally earlier on the AMP ranches, around April 25th, as opposed to May 17th. So AMP producers are able to stretch out their grazing season starting earlier, and they had a much longer total grazing season length, averaging around just over 7 months as opposed to about 4.5 months. So you can see that there are differences manifesting spatially and also temporally in what these producers are doing. The last thing I want to share with you is really the length of the early season grazing and the subsequent rest period. So we were very explicit with our questions. We asked producers during the early part of the growing season, which is generally up to about the end of July, so prior to August 1st, what's the maximum length of time that you will allow your animals into any given paddock? And so, and when we ask them that, and we develop this frequency histogram, what stands out very quickly is that AMP producers inevitably were striving for less than 8 days, and quite often less than 4 days. In fact, most of them were 3 days or less. So they were striving for a really short initial grazing period, whereas the non-AMP producers had this much higher length of early season grazing. And some of them, The continuous grazers were obviously several months long. The corollary is also true, that when we looked at the rest period, you get the opposite pattern. The AMP producers generally had at least 20 days of rest, and in fact, most of them had 60 days of rest before coming back into that individual paddock to regraze. The neighboring producers were exactly the opposite. Now, some of them were all over the place, but the majority of them, the single largest group, basically had this minimum rest period that was quite short. And of course, that would be our continuous grazers. So what we did is we actually combined those two pieces of information, the length of the early season grazing period with the minimum length of rest prior to regrazing, and we were able to develop a rest to grazing ratio. So this, you can think of this as a metric of grazing adaptation. So it's the number of days of rest per active or per day of grazing during the early growing season. And when you compute this out, you can see that there's really strong separation between essentially the AMP producers that always had an RGR greater than 6, as opposed to the neighboring operations that were almost always below 6. So, and the reason we're interested in this, we're looking for a combined metric to represent this producer behavior of trying to manipulate the spatial pattern and temporal pattern of grazing. Okay, the last slide I have before I turn it over to Bharat. In reality, all of these ranchers, all 60 of them, form a continuum. And so I started out earlier making the point that many of the previous research projects are binary. They compare AMP to non-AMP, or they compare holistic to non-holistic, or they compare continuous to everyone else. But that's a dangerous approach, in my opinion. And here's why. This output here is called an ordination. And what it does is it looks at the variance, in this case, in producer behavior. So the metrics that producers are using in order to basically categorize or describe their own grazing operations. And when you look at this, you can see that the AMP operators are basically, let me just get this right. So the non-AMP operators are all kind of clustered off to the left side. And if we had this really nice, clean binary separation, we should get one grouping here and we should get another grouping over here. You can see the AMP and the non-AMP, but that doesn't happen. What you see instead is that there's a continuous gradient of these ranches spread out across this wide gradient, which includes metrics like cattle stocking density, the rest to grazing ratio, the start of the grazing season, the stocking rate, the number of pastures, all these different metrics. And so the way I like to describe it is in Alberta, for example, we have 20,000 beef operators. Their grazing systems represent 20,000 different grazing systems. So to try to condense that all down into binary classes or 3 or 4 classes, to me, is probably not the best way to try to understand what these producers are doing or what impact it's having on the landscape. So I'm very much a fan of avoiding these simple categorical groupings, because I don't think they're representative of the real world. And instead, we should be using these specific grazing metrics that truly represent the behavior of individual ranchers and, of course, what they're trying to achieve with their animals on their landscape. Okay, so with that, Caitlin, I'm going to turn it back to you, and you can flip it over to Bharat, and he's going to go through the greenhouse gases and soil carbon.
Okay, Caitlin, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Which one is?
We can see the one with the pink flower.
I don't. I have second screen. How to show that one?
Okay. Do you want to bring your presentation up?
Yeah. This is in my second screen.
Yeah, we can see your mouse there.
Now? Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, good to go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathleen and Dr. Bork for covering most of the things. So I'll be talking much more about the greenhouse gas and soil organic carbon, especially the AH layer. So there are two components in this component of the project. First one is incubation study that we did with the soils removed from the 11 pair of ranches in Alberta. So greenhouse gas study was conducted in Alberta only, not Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So this study addressed the following core question. One was, are the grasslands subject to adaptive multi-paddock grazing superior to conventional grazing in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction? And do grazing system alter the sensitivity of grassland greenhouse gas fluxes to change in soil temperature and moisture? And what are the linkages between grazing regime, temperature, and moisture resulting greenhouse gas flux is mediated by soil microbes and enzyme activities? Then how it does in terms of the greenhouse gas emission incubation study compared to the field greenhouse gas emission. And final question was to how do AMP grazing affect soil organic carbon? So we did experimental approach for greenhouse gas monitoring. First was incubation trial. We used soils removed from field and brought in for incubation. Of course, it has many benefits. Also, it has drawbacks. First benefit was it removes all the externalities, including greenhouse gases in the field, and isolate microbially induced response to temperature and moisture. But it has drawback that it is not real representative of the actual field condition. Then field trial or in situ measurement of greenhouse gases throughout the growing season. We measured continuously three growing season from 2017 to 2019. It represents the real world scenario and direct link to greenhouse gas dynamics. But drawback is we were just measuring in 6 points in each range, and combined with high spatial variability, which may lower statistical power or detection of the effects might be difficult. So what we did in the incubation study was we collected soil from 11 pair of AMP grazed grassland and neighboring grassland across our climatic gradient in Alberta. We did 102-day lab incubation experiment at 2 temperatures, 5 degrees centigrade and 25 degrees centigrade, and 3 moisture level at permanent wilting point, 40% of the field capacity and at field capacity. And to see the direct effect and indirect effects, so we measure use the structural equation model, so that isolates what are the direct effects on final greenhouse gas fluxes and indirect effect on soil biological parameters like microbial and chemical parameters, microbial biomass, biomass nitrogen, and available nitrogen. And we also measured the enzymes, carbon cycling enzymes responsible for carbon emission, like xylodisase, beta glucosidase, cellobiodase, and then nitrogen cycling N-acetyl beta glucosidase. So from this temperature and moisture sensitivity analysis, what we found was the effect of temperature, like at the low temperature at 5 degrees centigrade, AMP grazed soil was emitting slightly higher. It was 70% higher carbon dioxide than non-AMP neighboring ranch. But at higher temperature, it was producing less carbon dioxide compared to the neighboring ranch. N2O didn't vary by grazing type, but of course it was increased with the temperature. And here, interesting is that methane consumption was always higher, even in low temperature and in high temperature. So it was removing methane from the atmosphere and consumed in the soil. In moisture, also like increasing with the moisture, it was increasing carbon dioxide release from the soil, and similar was the nitrous oxide, but they were not different by grazing type. They were almost similar. In methane, a story was also similar with increase in moisture, and then uptake of the methane was higher at the, with the increase in moisture level. So structural equation model we did for 3 selected days: first day of the incubation, and then day 13 and last day of the incubation, and with different determining factor. So if you see grazing, they don't have direct effect on carbon dioxide in all 3 days. Microbial biomass seems the main driver in all days, and then moisture was also effective from the day 1, but temperature was not affecting any in microbial biomass. But in day 13, it was affecting. But in 102 day, the effect of temperature on microbial biomass was not direct either. And for nitrous oxide, so effect of temperature and moisture was the as usual, it was clear in day 1, but in day 13, the moisture effect was not direct, but grazing was affecting the nitrogen cycling back enzyme, and then its effect was seen. And day 102, all effect was not that much direct for nitrous oxide. But in methane, here is the interesting story that all grazing has an effect from day 1 and day 13, but on day 1 and day 2, last day, effect was not direct. But indirectly, microbial biomass was playing the role in methane consumption as well. So here, this red arrow means higher consumption, and then thickness also represents the different, and this green arrow means positive relation, and microbial biomass was the determining factor. And then in the day 13, we can see all those kind of effect played by the microbial biomass. So in the field, as I mentioned earlier, that we went to Alberta. Only 12 pairs of ranches were sampled in all growing season from 2017 to 2019. In 2017, we could not cover whole growing season because experimental setup took a lot of time, and we were able to measure field emissions only after the middle of August. And we used dark chamber method, and 6 random sampling points were chosen to sample greenhouse gas emissions. And we also collected soil cores up to 1 meter depth, 15 soil cores from each ranch in 2017 in Alberta sites. I believe in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it was collected in 2018. So Dr. Jelong Ma has been working on this field GHG data. So what we found that soil temperature and moisture also vary during the growing season, and carbon dioxide also, if it follows similar trend. But you see, methane consumption was in all 3 years they were consumed in soil, but of course there was a lot of variability in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Nitrous oxide, they do not also differ that much between the grazing system, and they vary. Their variation was also quite strong. So there was no main effect of grazing treatment on any field greenhouse gas flux. But we also tried to see the effect of stocking rate and carbon dioxide flux. And this shows that in the moist soil, there is direct effect of increasing the stocking rate. Carbon dioxide flux from soil will be increased. But with the magic and moist side, it was not that much direct link. And in terms of carbon dioxide, methane, we tried to see the relationship between cultivation history, soil moisture, and bulk density. And it shows that if it was cultivated, cultivation history was there, it has a higher level of methane consumption as well. And soil moisture, of course, it was determining the field emission of field flux of the methane. Please note that all these negative numbers shows the not emission, but the consumption of carbon dioxide or methane from the atmosphere by the soil microbes. And bulk density, it is quite interesting also. Higher the bulk density, consumption was low, consumption was lower. Like this bigger number, if we plot positively, so this will go down. So higher the bulk density, then methane consumption is lower. So this is soil organic carbon in AS layer. Leo Sobrinho is doing a master's thesis on this soil data, and he shared this AS layer data in this presentation. And it shows soil mass, specifically topsoil AS layer, increased with the combined effect of elevated cattle stocking rates applied to the pasture having a longer rest period after early season grazing. So this is three-way graph, and then AS layer, you can see there are interaction effect of stocking rate and rest to graze ratio also. And in the right hand side, stocking rate and also rest to graze, and then this is soil organic carbon mass ton per hectare. So similar trend, similar to AS layer depth. So stocking rate, higher the stocking rate, so AS layer depth has also increased, and so does with the soil organic carbon mass. So from this study, what we found was soil GHG fluxes did not differ between grasslands subject to AMP or conventional grazing, but instead were regulated by management and environmental factors, including cattle stocking rate, cultivation history, soil moisture, and bulk density. Seasonal mean carbon dioxide emission increased with cattle stocking rate, but only in moist grassland. Seasonal mean methane uptake was higher in grassland never cultivated, and AMP grazed soil had lower methane emission at high temperature. So AMP grazed grassland had greater carbon sequestration in the topsoil. Carbon sequestration improved specifically from the combination of increasing cattle stocking rates plus longer rest after grazing. So with this, I would like to acknowledge all co-authors, AFC's AGGP program, Applied Ecological Service, AES Service USA, and participating ranchers in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Bunch of people were involved in this project. I don't know, I may have missed some names here. And we got wonderful help from Voice Lab staff as well. and I would like to acknowledge all of them. Thank you. And if you have any questions, we'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you both very much for the very interesting presentation. It's very timely and relevant to all of the issues that we're experiencing on the prairies today. There's a number of questions that have come in, so whoever feels most comfortable answering, go for it, I guess. The first one is from a listener named Patrick, and he says, it looks like only 2 sites were in the mixed grass prairie. Was there a reason for the low sample compared to fescue grassland sites? Does AMP grazing seem less feasible or at least less common on the lower productivity grasslands?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So I think that's a really good point. So the study was not designed to deliberately stratify and have an equal sample size among all the different natural subregions. Had we done that, we would have gone about it very differently. We would have said, okay, we want 10 in the mixed grass prairie, we want 10 in the parkland, we want 10 in the boreal transition. We did not do that. We did debate that for a while, but then we were worried about several things. First of all, we were worried about maybe that we weren't going to get enough AMP producers. The way the study was designed is we went out and recruited producers from different workshops and advertised the study, and then they came to us. So does the underrepresentation of the mixed grass prairie mean that AMP is less utilized out there? That might well be the case. So if you think about it, you know, because it's a more arid environment, there's a shorter kind of active growing season, that it might be less feasible to use this kind of AMP style system over a 6-month period. That's possible. I can't say that for sure, but what was very clear is that among the people that stepped forward expressing an interest, and we had about 100 initially, the vast majority by far were within the high rainfall environments of the parkland, you know, northern fescue, parkland, and then the boreal transition. And that was true in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. We only had a handful from the mixed grass prairie. And in fact, I think we only had 2 and we took them both because we were so, you know, we were trying to get representation, but without going out and deliberately pounding the pavement to recruit those people. And so I want to be very clear that we do have a big agroclimatic gradient that we can test, but it's clear that we have underrepresentation within the mixed grass prairie. We're very, very aware of that. One other limitation, and you know, when you think about this, the non-AMP are assumed to be representative of kind of a random grab bag of the beef producers in Western Canada, which is fine, except that they're looking at an AMP operator across the fence line. And so there is a chance, albeit fairly small, that they may be influenced by what they're seeing by their neighbor on the other side of the fence line. So I think the risk is pretty small, but we had to basically keep the sampling on the same soil polygon. And so we couldn't escape that potential bias, albeit I think it's small.
Thanks for that answer. The next question is from a listener named Hillary. Was there any differentiation between percent cultivation being used for annual crop production versus rejuvenating old perennial stands?
Well, we don't have data on that. So as I said in the methods, one of the caveats was that all of the land bases that we looked at had to be non-cultivated for at least 10 years. So none of the immediate areas that were sampled were actually undergoing cultivation now or even in the last 10 years. And in fact, you look at the mean date since cultivation, it was 19.5 years. So by and large, these were all long-term perennial systems. I mean, it does raise, it's a good question in that, could there be long-term legacy effects that could have gone on 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago? It's possible, but we cannot rule that out. This study was very different because we actually worked with cattle producers that are actively managing their herds and their pastures, which is very different than most other studies where they're done on a research station where you set up these controlled manipulative designs, but then there's no flexibility and adaptation built in. And that's the inevitable criticism that's levied at most of those studies, that they have basically removed the adaptation. And so here we did the opposite approach. We went and worked with producers and then tried to extract the management information under the Scout's honor, hope that that information is going to be robust on cross-examination and sufficiently accurate to pull out patterns. And the answer is it is pulling out patterns, because as you'll see on Friday, and as you saw in the data that Bharat presented from Lau Sobrino's master's work, which is under development, there is a carbon response to this interaction of stocking rate with RGR. You'll hear from Tim on Friday. He'll talk about these same metrics, and we are seeing signals. So there is value in going that approach, but the logistics are a challenge. Just to give you an idea how big this project was, I think the round trip, and if Jessica's on, she could correct me, but I think a round trip to all the ranches to sample was something like 6,000 kilometers.
Wow. A listener named Barry is wondering, when you screened ranches for the study and presumably fields within ranches for cultivation history, did you also screen for winter feeding on pasture?
We did.
Okay.
So I'm going to take that in two kind of slices. So we had to have at least a portion of the ranch that was free of bale feeding, so in situ bale feeding. And the reason for that is because we absolutely wanted to make sure we had a representative area in order to do the carbon stock assessment and the greenhouse gas flux assessment without this input of carbon. Because I can tell you that if you go in and you bale feed year after year after year, that's a huge addition of carbon. So of course you're going to build carbon. That's not the objective of our study. Our objective was not to determine whether bale addition increases carbon. I can tell you that, without even doing it. The question is whether the pattern of grazing as influenced by these different rotational systems influence carbon. So in our screening, we did ask the question to make sure there was an area that was free of bale grazing. Now, some of the producers, and I actually have a manuscript, it's on the management differentiation among these different ranches. Some of these ranchers admitted that they had bale graze, but not on the area we were working on. So there might have been a third of the ranch or something like that where bale grazing was going on. So it won't interfere with our ability to test the biophysical and the ecological responses, the root biomass and the plant diversity and all those kinds of things. But we are well aware that that was going on some of these ranches. That could also account for that tiny bump, even though it was non-significant in the aggregate stocking rate. It's possible.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Murray is wondering, do you have the tons of carbon hectares sequestered in A horizon and B horizon and C horizon, and any measurement of carbon loss tons per hectare in A horizon as soil dries out regardless of grazing?
Do you want to take that, Bharat?
Yeah, I can take that. Lio is working on that mineral layer data. We have estimated that carbon mass in layer wise, like we divided soil by organic layer and mineral layer. In organic layer is called AH layer. So that slide I presented was for the AH layer. So soil organic mass, if I see this one here, it goes from all the way 20 ton per hectare to 140 ton per hectare, depending on different stocking rate. And there is an interaction, as I said, rest to graze ratio and also the stocking rate. So there is interaction effect. So it goes all the way from 20 to 140, more than that. So yeah, for the mineral layer data, still we are working on. So Lio is working on that data.
Yeah, and I can answer that question from another project as well, because the one that I referenced where we looked at the over 100 grasslands in Alberta, the carbon stocks are quite astounding. And in that study, we only sampled to 30 centimeters, but we also looked at the overlying mulch layer, which is like the various decomposing layers of litter on the very surface of the mineral soil. And when we added it all up, the dry mixed grass, for example, was around 55 to 60 tons per hectare of carbon. When you get into those much more mesic, moist grasslands of the northern parkland or even the foothills of Alberta, we were pushing up to 150, 160, and even 180 tons per hectare of carbon. And that's excluding the deep carbon. That's not including anything below 30 centimeters. So that's an underestimate of the aggregate carbon storage. They store a lot of carbon.
Wow. Wow. A listener named Daniel is asking, he says, I see that CO2 emissions increased on AMP ranches on moist grasslands. Was this due to the possible higher evapotranspiration on moist grasslands versus drier grasslands?
That can be the reason, like evapotranspiration, but we didn't measure that parameter. So I think that is the good point to use in further analysis also. Yeah, evapotranspiration plays a greater role. Though we measure the soil temperature and moisture during the measurement of greenhouse gas, and I showed that one slide. It shows the relationship directly to moisture level as well. And similar information we found in incubation study. So if we increase the soil moisture level, so carbon dioxide or methane consumption both increase.
Thank you. And then back to the other question, Lio has actually typed in, Lio here, responding to the question asked to Bharat and Ed. Yes, we did have the carbon data from the AH layer, 0 to 30 centimeters, 30 to 60 centimeters, and 60 to 100 centimeters from A to B to C horizon. So thanks, Lio, for chiming in there. I know we're tight on time, so I'll just ask one more question if that's okay. Jennifer asks, what can we tell producers in the boreal transition that are already managing AMP and have been for many years? Is there opportunity for further studies?
Maybe.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Brad. That gives me a chance to think about it some more.
Yeah, we are thinking about like developing projects for this peace region in the future as well. But I think also Edward has some projects lined up. I don't know if he has considered the boreal region also. I think it is up. Let's hear from him.
Yeah, so I think there are very encouraging signs here that the boreal transition is this interesting one because they're gray wooded soils. They're often on the lower fertility side. So obviously building up, remember that all the carbon input has to come through plant growth. So if you don't have a really productive plant stand, you're not going to be fixing more carbon. You're not going to be putting inputs into the system. So then the question is, how do you get as much plant input into the system, and how do you get that translated into a stable carbon pool that's at or below the soil surface? And that's where, you know, I guess, obviously we're finding, you know, significant potential benefits of maybe employing at least some of these rotational systems to boost plant productivity. You know, I don't know whether Jessica's listening in today, but Jessica Granke, her PhD project is quantifying the plant biomass and root mass. And so there are, for example, there are net increases in plant biomass associated with the AMP type grazing system. And so that's the vector for the carbon inputs. So that's a good sign. So if you can fix more carbon, and if that works its way into the ground, coupled with things like reduced methane losses or increased methane uptake, and I just want to reiterate that those negative values that Bharat was showing, for example, on the incubation data are incredibly important, because an uptake means that the microbes in the soil are removing methane from the atmosphere. That's a good thing, because it means they're helping counteract In fact, I did a few years ago a back of the envelope calculation because someone asked me, well, how much methane can these microbes remove, and can it offset what ruminants produce, what cattle produce? And my back of the envelope calculation said they can't replace all of it. They can't reduce all of it, but they can reduce maybe up to 25%. That's a pretty good news story. So, and yet not a whole lot of people know about it. I'll just finish up on this question with this. So there's a long-term study area southwest of Edmonton called the Breton plots. And it is a series of plots looking at enhancing the fertility and sustainability of gray wooded soils. And there are 40-year-long crop rotations of perennial forage, long-term crop rotation, including 3 out of 8-year forage, 2 out of 5-year forage. And what we are now doing, we actually got funding to start a project looking at soil health and looking at carbon storage and looking at the relative contribution of the forage component within there at helping build carbon and change carbon cycling dynamics. So hopefully when we have that, we will have more insight to go back to, was it Patrick or no, Daniel, and hopefully tell Daniel with more specific ways in which he can capture more carbon. And the interesting thing about gray wooded soils is because they're starting out at a lower equilibrium, there's potential to build a lot more soil carbon. Then the fight will be on, and how do we make sure those producers get paid for it, right?
Awesome. I just want to mention that Jessica Grenke did a webinar for us in the past. I can't remember if it was a year or two ago now, but it's available on the PCAP YouTube channel. So I guess that's all the time that we have for today. So I just want to thank you both so much for the awesome presentation. We had a great turnout today, and I think everyone's going to go home and think about this. And yeah, it's really amazing the research that you're doing. So thank you for taking the time to share it with us today.
Okay, thank you. So if there are any questions we could not answer, if they're due to time, you can email to us and we'll try to reach out to them with the answer.
Perfect. That would be great. To all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for catching today's webinar. We have 2 more going on this week as part of Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Please check out the PCAP website to register. This webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in the near future. And when you leave today's webinar, there will be a quick 1-minute survey that'll pop up. If you don't mind filling it out, we really appreciate it and keeps us going on with our webinars in the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.